The defense industry has become a major player in the domestic homeland security market, estimated to be worth over $20 billion in goods and services.
Flashbangs, tear gas, rubber bullets, helicopters, armored vehicles.
Historically, going back to the 1960s and 70s, police had shields and riot truncheons and tear gas, but they didn't tend to drive armored vehicles down city streets.
The militarization of police is a trend that's grown for decades. It first came into the limelight during the Ferguson protests in 2014.
We had this outsized, I would characterize it as a hyper-exaggerated response on the part of the police who looked like soldiers.
In America, every 40 hours, a black person is killed by police. And every 1 out of 1,000 black people can expect to die due to police violence. These are statistics that should unnerve us all.
Did you know they had this kind of firepower?
No, not at all.
With military equipment and training on full display across the country, many are questioning its implications. How exactly is local law enforcement acquiring military equipment? And does the gear help keep communities safe? Since 2005, the defense industry has spent over $100 million in lobbying efforts annually, partially to secure their interest in the domestic homeland security market worth over $20 billion in goods and services. Their contributions play a major role in maintaining a steady flow of militarized equipment to local law enforcement.
Certainly vendors, companies that manufacture the technology that the police are purchasing are profiting from this. The police, obviously, they're not in the business of profiting from private acquisitions.
We've seen extensive lobbying from defense industries who produce educational videos for police, who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to directly lobby Congress for defense spending, but also for these police programs.
The police also have their own lobbying organizations that work towards securing budgets and equipment for local law enforcement. The National Fraternal Order of Police is one of them, and has lobbied in favor of federal grants that are responsible for the militarization of police.
It's really a variety of homeland security grants administered by the COPS office, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, that have allowed departments to directly purchase military-grade equipment. And this has been essential to stimulating a domestic law enforcement market for military contractors. In some cases, the folks who provide the equipment actually directly assist police departments in making these grants. There's even a website that is sponsored by these defense contractors and other providers of police equipment to aid departments in the production of these grant proposals.
This whole industry grew significantly during the War on Drugs campaign in the 1970s.
Congress passed a law that focused on incorporating cooperation between the military and the local law enforcement, particularly related to countering drug crimes and the war on drug, right? That was sort of the first connection between the military and domestic law enforcement.
In 1989, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, temporarily allowing the Department of Defense to transfer excess military equipment to federal and state agencies. The program continued until the 1997 National Defense Authorization Act expanded it to include local law enforcement and made it permanent under a new name, the 1033 program. That began a massive transfer of military equipment to local police departments free of charge, as long as they paid for shipping and maintenance.
The 1033 program was that congressional authorization that allowed police departments to basically go online. There were catalogs of weapons and vehicles and aircraft and watercraft, and any kind of surplus military equipment was available for the asking, and it was at no cost to law enforcement agencies.
Departments may purchase shotguns that are placed in police vehicles as a routine matter. And some departments are purchasing a variety of less lethal weaponry with their own resources. But when we see sniper equipment, armored vehicles, large amounts of body armor, this is often the result of federal spending.
Since its inception, over 11,500 domestic law enforcement agencies have taken part in the 1033 program. receiving more than $7.4 billion in military equipment.
What you end up seeing is, as a result of the 1033 program, local law enforcements continue to ramp up what we call special task force, like SWAT teams, gang task force, drug task force, right? That all utilize this excess military material.
In July 2014, Congressman Alan Grayson proposed a legislation to limit the transfer of certain weapons through the 1033 program. The amendment was met with immense opposition, failing on a bipartisan vote of 62 to 355. The people who voted not to change the 1033 program received 70% more money in campaign contributions from the defense sector than those who wanted restrictions.
Yeah, one of the really troubling developments about the involvement of the federal government in the direct subsidy of purchases of militarized equipment is that this is really about creating a new market for defense contractors rather than really putting questions of public safety first.
Besides providing free military equipment, the federal government also allows the police to purchase new equipment using their own funds under the 1122 program. It also gives local police departments the same discounts enjoyed by the federal government.
We've seen instances across the country where local governing bodies like boards of selectmen and mayors and city councilors are often unaware that tax dollars have been expended to acquire these kinds of military weapons and military vehicles.
What makes both 1033 and 1122 programs so powerful is the lack of clear oversight and accountability. The 1122 program, for instance, is not a grant or transfer program, and thus is not required to be monitored by the federal government. Meanwhile, the 1033 program has put lethal weapons in the hands of officers who have no justifiable need for such equipment.
We've seen instances reported of some small towns, even some college and university police departments that were acquiring military-grade weapons without any demonstrable need for the use of these or the acquisition of these weapons.
After the events in Ferguson, the Obama administration sought to tighten the 1033 program with additional requirements and restrictions.
After months of confrontations on America's streets, President Obama today banned the federal government from giving some types of military equipment to local police.
You know, we've seen how militarized gear can sometimes give people a feeling like there's an occupying force as opposed to a force that's part of the community that's protecting them and serving them.
And this led to calls in Congress to eliminate 1033 and eventually measure an executive order by the Obama administration to place some limits on the type of equipment that could be used. Things like bayonets and turreted armored vehicles.
The Obama administration also required police agencies to justify purchases of equipment considered potentially lethal. President Trump, however, rescinded all of those measures within 2 years in office.
The Obama administration made some efforts to increase accountability and auditing of this, but even then, the restrictions and oversight were quite limited. Under the Trump administration, there's even less evidence of any oversight, any sense that we know how this equipment is being used or whether or not officers are being properly trained in how to use it.
In some cases, equipment transferred through these programs has simply vanished due to a lack of oversight and poor bookkeeping.
There have been a number of situations where there have been audits of local police departments to try to figure out what they've done with this equipment, and these departments have been unable to provide adequate records. We don't know if this is a local sheriff taking home camping supplies or if this is about, stuff that's really gone missing, has been resold, or has just simply been lost.
Oftentimes, the militarization of the police force might be what's distracting them from their original purpose, protecting our communities.
There's no direct correlation between having military equipment from the 1033 program and seeing a reduction in crime or an increase in officer safety. When you increase the military equipment to police departments, you often increase the likelihood of violence within communities from police.
The research I've overwhelmingly done shows that police officers are trained for tactics and worst case scenarios. However, their interactions on a regular basis are not worst case scenario. They are not dealing oftentimes with school shootings or mass shootings. They deal with those, but instead primarily what they're doing is having a conversation with someone. And if they're only spending 8 hours on de-escalation and nearly 60 hours firing a gun, and then another large chunk of time driving a vehicle. Well, when they get in a situation, this is why they pull guns when people don't think those guns should be pulled, because that's what they have been trained to do.
When they bring this military hardware and this kind of potential for the use of force and violence to a protest, that's something that's not going to produce the desired outcome. It's going to make people angry. It's going to make them outraged. It's going to frighten them. It's going to make them feel that the police are not there to ensure that they are safely able to engage in the activities that they're engaging in that are protected by the Constitution.